So it is my honor to introduce Negar and Matthew this evening. Negar Ahkami's work is rich in color and detail. Inspired by her Persian ancestry, she embraces a fantastical quality associated with Islamic art and utilizes cultural references to, as she has said, reflect the neuroses of our time as well as those of the artist. Negar was born in Baltimore and grew up in New Jersey in the suburbs of New York City. She attended the Art Students League of New York and then received her BA from Columbia in Middle Eastern Languages and Cultures and her JD from Georgetown University Law Center, as she briefly mentioned. And while developing her artistic work, she began to practice law but departed from that path to receive her MFA from the School of Visual Arts in New York. Really interesting path. Her work has been shown both independently and in group exhibitions at museums, galleries, and universities around the globe. We're fortunate to have her in the Beyond and excited to have her here tonight. Matthew Ronay's colorful, boldly original sculptures are hard to miss. Mixing modernist abstraction with non-Western and ritualistic traditions of art making, his work explores what it means to produce the handmade object. Matthew's from Louisville, Kentucky, and lives, sorry about that, and lives in, yeah, I know, lives and works in Brooklyn. He received his BFA from the Maryland Institute College of Art and his MFA from Yale. Matthew's work has also been shown in the US and globally in various museums and galleries. The conversation this evening will be moderated by Alejo Benedetti. He's our assistant curator for contemporary art here at Crystal Bridges. And he, as a member of the exhibition team for the Beyond, Alejo has worked closely with both artists. So please join me in welcoming Negar, Matthew, and Alejo. Thank you.
Okay. So we have a PowerPoint, but it's just going to be on loop. And we're going to talk. We might sort of navigate back and forth throughout that, but otherwise we're just going to just chat. And I have about 1 million questions to ask. We won't get to all of those, but I think a fun place to start is this is sort of an interesting pairing, the two of y'all, if you were to just look at the artworks. And so I think a fun place to start is to actually talk a little bit about materials and craft. And so in the case of Matthew, obviously it's working with wood in a sort of unexpected way, and with Negar, it's working with oil paint in a sort of non-traditional way, but then also incorporating things like a whole lot of gesso or glitter and fingernail polish. And so if y'all could talk a little bit about craft and material.
I just feel I go through phases where I get very attached to certain materials, and the gesso was really something I became very obsessed with and has stuck. I began just kind of letting the gesso congeal a bit in the early 2000s, 2001. And noticed how you can just really just build these sort of bas-relief surfaces just with the gesso. I just, the sort of ceramic-looking textures for me really relate to this use of gesso as a material, and in a very wrong way. I mean, you're taught as a painter to be, gessoing thin layers and veils and sanding, and I, kind of started having a lot of fun playing with materials and breaking rules. I think it had to do with having to follow rules at such an early stage, whether it's the Art Students League and this kind of very, realist mode of making art, an observational way of making art, or going to a school that I didn't really want to be going to. And I felt very freed by contemporary artists who were breaking those kinds of rules. And glitter, a lot of the sort of everyday materials for me, the glitter really just reminds me of what I love so much about Persian art, just this jewel-like aesthetic, and just gravitating to glitter and the sort of disco era of New York, but just really finding a connection between these certain specific colors of glitter and specific objects from bazaars in Iran from when I was a kid, specific jewels that I remember, and just this kind of blingy, kind of very ostentatious, I would say, aesthetic, consumerist kind of aesthetic that I was very exposed to growing up, just seeing tons of Iranians like dressed up to the nines, like on a dance floor, as my parents would organize a lot of these sort of New Year parties for Persian New Year, for the diaspora in the New York area in the 80s and 90s, and just these ballrooms filled with very sort of glamorous but sort of over-the-top sequins and lots of makeup, and how that related to the sort of drag queens that I would see in clubs as a teenager in New York. Just this something that I would gravitate to and sort of observed in my world. So, yeah.
And for me, I think really using wood was a kind of a practical, not super romantic endpoint to kind of researching how to create the works that I made. My earliest inspirations were people like Joseph Cornell and stuff like that, and so I was doing a lot of carpentry and just became very familiar with the material. I'm not a person who liked making molds or using really heavy machinery or stuff to do marble or something like this, and so I started carving wood and subtracting from a pretty early on in the history of me making my works. And so over the years, I've really just spent so much time working in this material that I can kind of make whatever is in my mind happen in wood. So it's kind of more of a practical endeavor for me.
Well, and I think that's interesting because you obviously have this commitment to wood, and that comes through when you're looking at this. Not maybe when you first approach it, but as you sort of live with it for a second, and you see that the wood grain is still there. You do that very intentionally, and I wonder if you can talk a little bit about how you came to that decision, but then also how sort of preserving that texture or that patterning in the wood or throughout the work becomes important and interesting.
Well, like when you're working with wood, like for me, for my personal practice, it's always really a goal of how to translate what was everything almost that I make starts as a drawing. And so although drawing is done on wood with charcoal or a pencil or something that's also wood kind of, really for me, it's always a goal of how to translate the drawing. And so I've learned over the years different ways of translating the lines into cuts with the saws and ways to stack things and make things work together. And really, since one of my main inspirations is nature and how things grow, I've always wanted to be a kind of creative entity whose culminations had this feeling of being grown rather than made. And so in that sense, early on, I kind of tried to figure out a way to use one single piece of wood to make something so that when you cut this piece and then you cut this piece and then you sculpt those pieces, they form to each other in the same way that like the organs form or a tree like grows over a fence or something like that, like something that happened over a long period of time. And so I think the material lends itself really well to doing that because you have a block or a plank, and as you cut it up, those pieces then fit back together. And so drawing is also that way. If you draw like one line and then you draw another line, you have a tube. And then if you draw another line on top of that, it's as if one tube is laying on top of another tube. And so the process of making my work using band saws and things like that, I cut the works and then I sculpt the pieces, and then they have the illusion as if they're ceramic or something soft.
Sure. Yeah. Well, and obviously you also are incorporating Negar. You are also incorporating sort of repetition and patterning into your work in a vastly different way. Yeah. But I wonder if you could speak about that a little.
Yeah, it's funny, I'm so obsessed with Persian art. It's something that I became obsessed with as a teenager. It was the way in which I found my connection to my Iranian heritage, which was such a fraught thing from the time when I was growing up. The hostage crisis, the revolution happened. It was really, really hard time to be Iranian in America. Those years were dark for a lot of people, and being born and raised here, I didn't have the same experience as the people who had to leave their country. But I had my sisters had their own private pain, and art was the way in which I found my way back. And the patterns, the multitude of patterns, the simultaneity of patterns, the geometric, calligraphic, floral, spirals, in one particular piece, the rhythm, the visceral feeling that you get from whether you're looking at a tiny miniature and your eye is just getting lost and traveling around and around from thing to thing, and the pattern kind of helps move that. Or if you're in like an Iranian mosque, which is just, I wish everyone could have that experience. You could actually go on these websites, like 360 type map situations, and look up and feel like, and visit these sites in Iran and Esfahan, where you're in these buildings that almost look like the Taj Mahal. I mean, the Taj Mahal is very sort of inspired by Persian mosque architecture, and you're surrounded by so much pattern at the same time. And that visceral impact, that thing that does here, it's like a kick in the gut, I kind of wanted to take that out of the realm of beauty and transcendence and into the realm of expression, expressiveness, psychological. For me, that sometimes pushing cacophony to extremes that make me look like a madman, but it's because the narratives are about something that's so out of control and depressing and awful, and sometimes being a little bit more harmonious. For me, that's like a tool, an expressive tool, as much as drips and gestures were for the abstract expressionists. The pattern is just a tool of showing some sort of psychological feeling. So.
Sure. Well, and so I think that's sort of interesting, in how you how obviously your work is sort of connected to the real world, but sometimes it doesn't feel like it necessarily exists in that. We're just going to keep on going. We're going to pretend that that didn't even happen. I'm not going to draw attention to it.
This is how I am in my studio all
the
time. So it doesn't faze me.
No, but so something that's sort of interesting for me is that your work lives very much is very much touching the real world, but it also has these sort of surreal qualities to it. And I wonder if maybe you can talk about that, and you also obviously have a number of surreal sort of qualities to your work, and so if y'all could maybe talk about that.
Yeah, well, I really happen to love Fantastica and the kind of Orientalist associations with magic, Aladdin and magic carpets, and I felt a guilty pleasure in that kind of iconography. It's in a way this starvation for any kind of connection when Iran was so isolated from this country and deemed as put in the corner basically. And so any kind of areas of cultural connection I would soak up. And so even though there's some problematic representation in Orientalism, Fantastic is something that's just, I think I always had kind of a wild imagination, whether it goes to dark places and paranoia or just beauty and fantastical places. That was the one thing I always had. And so it's inevitable that it goes into the work. It's just kind of part of how I express myself, I think, or my deep feeling. I think I don't think of it as surrealism, or I think of it as more as Fantastica, I guess. Yeah.
For me, I think I'm very interested in psychology as well, and I feel like the main use of surrealism that often gets overlooked because people think of it as nonsensical is that, in a way, especially for somebody like Magritte, it wasn't about dreaming, it was about being awake and about being engaged in a kind of Jungian way into looking into your unconscious and trying to understand what's there, what your hang-ups are, what you're not actually aware of. And I think for me, my creativity and my studio practice are a way for me to try to kind of transform myself and kind of experience my hidden feelings about the world, or even the vibe of the world that's hidden, that maybe I wouldn't be able to articulate so well should I be consciously trying. And so for me, opening up yourself to experiencing your unconscious is a way to, in my mind, to create a super logic, maybe a logic that would be hidden from a more logical or scientific approach to narrative or constructing a communication. And so for me, most of everything that I do starts with automatic drawing, which is a simple way to think of it, but in a way it's just doodling. And so I just decide I need to draw, I start drawing, and then the drawings, that way I have no judgment or pre-expectations of what can be. And to me, I think that's the useful thing about surrealism, and I think maybe in the time that it was invented, it was also a different moment where people weren't always, people say now, oh, it's so surreal, but then it wasn't, they were just beginning to understand things like synchronicity or something strange that happens that you have no way of understanding.
Sure.
Although it's connected to the real world, whether it be geographical and political or self-transformation or whatever it is, it always works itself out somehow. If you're ignoring it, it ends up coming up later. And so I always think that there's a real use in surrealism to bring up things that you're hiding.
Yeah. Well, and so I wonder, you obviously talk about the unconscious as being the sort of source of inspiration, and I wonder, Negar, if what your sort of relationship to the unconscious is. I believe you have some thoughts on this.
It's very integral. I mean, I actually don't think of it as unconscious, although you could define it that it's semantic maybe. I think of it as intuitive, in a way, it's hard to know where one thing starts and one thing ends, because it is so integral to my being to operate from a place of intuition and emotive kind of, it's part of my mantra, in a way. And when I set out to go into my art more seriously, I really wanted there to be such thing as a Persian art that was more, expressionistic and psychological and, intuitive and have an authentic vocabulary representing the vision of the artist, which is very Western in a way. My Western art heroes, my European art heroes, modernist, post-impressionist, bringing those things together seems like such a logical thing, things that I love to, it's like Reese's peanut butter cup, things that you love together, bring them together. But yes, a lot of the iconography, and there's so much symbolism. This piece is from 2001, right after 9/11. And I'm, the most strictly dealing with like iconography, I didn't even have a studio. It was right after 9/11, and I had coffee cup stains sort of on my paper. And I associated that with when you read the newspaper and you have a coffee cup stain. And I would start these works on paper with just these coffee cup stains, and I would literally just see imagery in that. And then with the paintings, I would glob on the gesso and I would see blobs that looked like minarets and domes and power plants at the same time. So the iconography, and then I was doodling a lot at that time, and they were very raw doodles that were, that it's almost like interpreting a dream. When you look at them, you kind of becomes clear why you did that.
Sure.
And so over time, even though it's very unconscious or intuitive, over time you become, it becomes intentional. And so it's hard to know where that begins and ends, but that's because I revisit certain symbols over long stretches of time instead of just to fill a gallery space. The revisitation of those symbols kind of changes over time. With intention, and because I'm working spontaneously, I might have a very raw compositional sense of where this is going to go. I have no idea where the color's going to go, no idea where the pattern's going to go. Details in narrative end up happening spontaneously. So that's part of the fun, that's part of the struggle, but it's there's a lot of room for intuition in this process.
Mm-hmm. Well, so I want to piggyback on something that you just said, and actually, so kind of how the sausage gets made with these sorts of talks. We talk a little bit before, and we send some ideas over, or they send ideas over what's sort of interesting to them, and something that Matthew said was particularly interesting to him to talk about is narrative. And I think that you just brought it up, but I'd love to hear you talk about narrative as it relates to your work.
Well, for me, in the images that we put into the PowerPoint are
To get to your images.
No, they showed. They were there. But in my earliest works that were more representational and less abstract, when we were talking earlier, I was describing about when I was in graduate school that the fashion at the moment then in 98 to 2000, in the 1900s, was kind of very intellectual, very theory-based. And so when I went to Yale, they accepted different people for different strengths. I was comparing it to the Real World, the MTV show, where they invite people so that they fight. And so I was a maker, and so I was invited for that, and I was attacked a lot for being intuitive. And so I had to toughen up and figure a way out to protect myself. And so in a way, I used narrative as an intellectual tool to kind of prove to people that something like surrealism or something that was like kind of some non sequiturs together, that there was a real place there for either political or sociological or intellectual, play. Mm-hmm. And so for me, the metaphor that I always used was, I used to call it forensic narrative, in the same way that like when Sherlock Holmes comes onto the scene, he looks at what's there, so you look at what symbols are in the work, but then you triangulate it always with something else that's not there, your knowledge about polo or whatever, so for me that's what I did. So I would take the objects and then I would say, well, this hamburger that's on top of this purse is the result of a riot between upper and lower class or whatever, and that and so I would try to use these things to try to create a situation where you could say of course everything can be political or non sequitur, it's not just a non sequitur, that there's there's no hierarchy of symbolism, that mm-hmm. It's you can make it into whatever you want. And then I think as I got older, I desired less to have this, for myself, selfishly, to not have the specificity to have to be responsible to explain it to someone when I was done.
Sure.
And so for me, as a person who's experiencing my own life, it was more exciting for me to try to create a practice in which I was going further and further into a realm of unknowingness. And that's really what is exciting to me while I'm spending 100 hours making a sculpture to try to figure out what happened, mm-hmm. and to not necessarily be beholden to language or narrative. And so for me, the trajectory is really from narrative as protection to losing the narrative to preserve my creativity and my patience and stuff.
That makes a lot of sense. I aspire to that someday. Although my work is changing for sure. A lot of the images span like a long stretch of time. And I feel like I got a lot of the sort of more direct political iconography eventually out of my system. Of course, things have not really changed politically in this country, but it's almost so painful that I want to escape it. And so I'm even though I have one thread of work that's still quite directly about this marginalization of Iranian art contributions to global history, that's still sort of inside of me, that's still going forward. There's this other strain in my work that's totally escapist and reveling in the fact that I don't have to explain this work to anyone. That is a total revelation for me. I recently showed it where I have a residency in Arlington, Virginia. This dance floor that's a Persian carpet. It's partly a tribute to these, Iranian dance floors that I was exposed to growing up, and these packed dance floors of 80-year-olds and toddlers, and these parquet ballrooms in hotels for these Persian New Year parties, and but just transforming the gallery space into this. If a person feels so moved to get on there, and there's the Aladdin lamp with the Amazon Alexa there, so that you can, ask for a song, and to actually see that happen was really moving for me. I mean, I felt very depressed in the last year and a half, a lot of anxiety and depression based on the news, and for me to like escape from politics and to give somebody else, a total stranger, a joyful escape, whilst communing with the patterns and the things that I love about Persian art, is just kind of everything. And it's a direction that I really love to explore further. I still think of it as painting, but it's, you know, but yeah, I totally get what that must feel like for you to go from these complex narratives to just beautiful form and color and just, you know, can I jump in with a question?
Yeah,
like,
yeah,
I
by
mean,
all
when I
means.
found out that your wife is from Turkey, I instantly thought about just the fractal aspects of, you know, just these organisms that are in our body or in nature, and then making them bigger and sort of making you think of the different scales of this within us and around us. And I don't, is that something you think about consciously, or is it just something that went into your, I think about the multitude of patterns and the fractal nature of the patterns. And
Yeah. For me, I mean, just being married to someone who's not where, like, from my town or my country was just really such a blessing. And I think it's just really, it made me listen and learn, and it just made me, it allowed me, out of my love for her, to also like research all about her religion and her everything. And one of the most exciting things about that was that I'm a big like carpet person. You know, I like the Persian garden carpets are some of my favorite. They look
amazing.
like they look like electronic stuff.
Yeah.
And
I totally want to do a dance floor of a garden carpet.
And when I researched like the Turkish kilums, like the thing that really excited me, for example, was that they were all made by women, like during, you know, like the off times of harvesting, like in the fall. And that one of the things that I found most interesting about it was that even though the patterns are recognizable, that it wasn't like we learned in our art schools to make art where you're taught how to mix paints, for example. I'm just bullshitting, but like, and composition, and then you like do your expression. The design of a kilum and the technique are together.
Right.
You don't learn the technique and then make your own design. You learn them together. And it was stuff like that, and then beyond that, then that somehow the symbols were like mnemonic devices, that they helped you remember about certain plants or certain areas. Or these are the kinds of things that I really value about like a lot of non-Western art, is that the complexity of the connection to the making and the craft and everything is not always like what I do, where it's about self-expression and all this stuff. That there's something like truly integral, and the fabric is tighter. And so for me, it was really, that's why I say I feel like it was a blessing to be able to spend my life with somebody who can every day kind of teach me something that's something different. And so, and then also for me, Turkey in particular, the thing about it that I really value is this amazing handmade quality to the way that everything is done. So like, and especially in a place like Istanbul, maybe they're building like an actually pretty modern public bathroom, but then instead of like in Switzerland having like a little blue tile that says WC, a guy just comes with a big paintbrush and just does a huge WC on it. You know, like those are the kinds of things that I really feel like are so like full of soul and organic in a way that I feel like is the way that I can really appreciate those kinds of things. And so that's my connection to Eastern culture.
It's nice to hear.
And then also all the manners and food, and I mean it's just endless for me. So
I wonder if you know, you talked about something about these carpets that you know, there's this thing that's really interesting, that you can't sort of separate the process, and so much about what you do, that you have this sort of first stage and then you have a second stage. And earlier you talked about it, or earlier in your gallery talk, you related it to architecture. And I think that's a fascinating thing, and I wish you could talk a little bit about how sort of that metaphor is sort of actually playing out in your work?
Well, for me, I was when I was in high school and in part of college, I made models as a job, and for a architectural glass artist. So they did windows for like churches and hospitals and stuff, and it was my job to like make a paper version, mat board version of like those views. Mm-hmm. And so my early like making history, I did a lot of math and a lot of like thinking of architecture. And so I'm also a very disciplined person, like in terms of my practice. I'm a meditator, and I just get strength from routine, which I think is annoying in some ways because it's closed-minded. But then there's a part of me that's also very open to experience, and so there's kind of there's always two people inside of me. Sometimes like a devil and an angel. And so for me, that goes for all sorts of things in my work. Like I really appreciate newness, but I also really get a lot of strength from repeating. And when is it okay to repeat? And when is it good to innovate and to create new imagery? And or when you repeat, does it continually unfold? And can you continue to unfold all the meanings and the repetition? And so for me, architecture, I think, is one of the amazing disciplines because it's very rational, but it's very integral to our being because it's our shelter. And so it's one of the things that we probably at our most early times invented. And so, but at the same time, it's very personal, how you want it to be. Do you want your room like this, your house like this? Does it look like this? And it's a very strange way to express yourself, I think. Even though as a sculptor doing what I do, I still think architecture is one of the most craziest ways to express ideas because it has to be practical and you have to live in it, and it's for people, and then beautifully it's opened up to what happens inside of it, like a church or a mosque or a temple. And so for me, I think as sculptors, often what you do is you make a sculpture, but then you place it on a base. And the base, like I said in my lecture, the function of the base is to impart some sort of reason to the unlogical thing that you've done on top of it. And so for me, that was always my relationship to architecture, was like, how do I lay a breadcrumb trail so that we can like get back to reality for a second and like, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and so Negar, of course, you see where this is going because you incorporate architecture, but it so often is not sort of functional in a traditional sense.
Right. It's symbolic. Again, developed from a very long stretch of time of psychological iconography that then became sort of intentional. But just, yes, I mean, my obsession with these Persian mosques that are just, to me, like a pinnacle of art history that is just under-recognized in many ways, and its connection to such great architecture worldwide, the tiles within the mosques, and yet my sort of cartoonish portrayal of these mosques really is just this expression of something that I couldn't really put to words, which had to do with just the way in which the culture has been degraded and cartoonified. Something so rich and complex and influential and a source of inspiration globally has been cartoonified and simplified and, rendered into this beast that's like this blob with tentacles, smokestack minarets, this paranoia of Islamic, spreading, mosque as factory and people, replicating and spreading around the globe, and these very painful things that sort of I would hear every hour on the hour in the news. I would listen to NPR, WNYC in my studio, even now in Arlington, Virginia. That's often I listen to that. And for just so long, every hour on the hour, the NPR news would be about Iran, like an update about its nuclear threat. And to me, that actually produced a lot of anxiety because it's starting with the Iraq war in 2003 is when this, updates about Iran's nuclear program kind of was happening. And so all I could think was, especially from my Middle Eastern studies major background, was that this is a pretext for war. This is a justification, to bomb Iran, to destroy, and to, and it just unearths all of these just difficult feelings that I had since childhood about Iran and watching in real time the representation changing overnight. and Iran suddenly becoming this demonic place and just this very simplified version of the story. And yet, at the same time, the imagery was very much a critique against the regime itself and its buffoonery and its failures and vulgarity. And so it was a dual sort of expressive image that helped satisfy this deep feeling within me that I felt was dangerous. I was told repeatedly that, people in the art world didn't see anything wrong with it. What's wrong with that when you have porn in the art world and all that? Like, there's nothing, a penile minaret is not such a big deal, but people from other countries, Iranian artists, there are other artists that understood how dangerous some of the image could be, and it was a mind screw, and it was not something I was comfortable. I didn't want to be pressing buttons. I didn't want to be provocative. It came from a very deep and genuine place. It was, I kept returning to it over literally like a 12-year period. Mm-hmm. It was not something I just did for a show. And I couldn't help it, but yeah. I would repress that imagery, I think, and yet I felt like it was still true in the culture, and that it was, I called it yesterday, we had a nice little talk before, and I showed some images of these Joe Camel ads from the 90s, where Camel cigarettes, I guess historically, was this like Orientalist kind of mythology and the advertising of Turkey, and just the Orientalism was all the rage in the early 1900s, and Camel cigarettes was part of that mythology and advertising. And then in the 90s, there was Joe Camel, which was giant penis, literally billboards everywhere. You couldn't escape it. It was like, ah! And I felt like they're kind of saying something about the Middle East here. Like, it's not just, that's how I felt. That wasn't what the intention was necessarily, but I literally, in that imagery, I just thought of, what goes on in the culture is this Joe Camelization of Islamic culture, Persian culture, this refined, complex thing turned into this, penis, basically. No offense to the male anatomy, but that's, that's where this imagery partly was coming from, and and yet it was dangerous, and yet, you have an artist like Jason Rhodes that could make mecha tuna and be celebrated, and, not have any flack for it, and I was literally screamed at, from the outset of doing my work in public places, and told that I should never go to Iran, put on lists. So it was, but that's where that kind of dual imagery comes from. Yeah. That's a lot.
No, that was great, and I think at this point, if folks have questions, we've been talking. It's been fun. But let's see if other folks have questions, and if not, I can come up with stuff.
You need a mic?
Yeah.
No, I don't need a mic. I talk loud. Question, actually, for Negar. The bridge, specifically. Mm-hmm. Some of your paintings have what look like tentacles, or maybe spouts.
Yeah.
And the question I frequently will get asked is, on the left, and I'm talking specifically about the bridge.
Yeah, the left-hand side, the sort of Persianate kind of side. Yeah, the Persian.
What is it? Spouts? Is it tentacles?
Well, again, that's the smokestacks. I literally lived on 57th Street for 20 years, and my parents have a place in Midtown still. I don't know, what is it about Midtown Manhattan? It's so not a neighborhood anyone wants to live in. And yet here I am, looking at these Queens smokestacks. Okay. And all I could think of, and even just the Indian Hill power plant, right? That power plant, up the Hudson River, always to me looked like a mosque, like a Persian mosque. And so it was a deliberate connection that started maybe with doodles and globs of gesso that I made just from literally just looking at these smokestacks every single day and thinking about, America sort of views Iran as this polluting source of menace, like this factory, this paranoid view, Islamophobic view. It's like a factory, the way they view something so exquisite as this architecture. So that's why there's a hole. It's sort of penile. It's sort of, you know, flaccid. I mean, even just when you hear like, on my, but it is
Maybe
that
you
way
should.
in the news. I got a text message on my phone. I'm in the studio working, and on my phone, like the news text, it says Trump pulls out. It's like, even just the rhetoric is very, like it's ingrained, it's there, so. I'm feeding off of what I feel is out there.
Stick with smokestacks.
Stick with melting, you could think of them as melting, like a meltdown, like a nuclear meltdown. Islamophobia spreading towards the New York side of the skyline, like the blob. Yes.
Yeah.
I don't have a question as much as a comment. I went to a talk by a writer once who is Chinese and from China, and she married somebody from Ireland. And her daughter looks a lot like her Irish husband. Her son looks a lot like her. When she'd be out with her daughter, they want to know if she was the nanny.
Oh, I have that experience with my own kids.
And this is her daughter.
Yeah.
And the other part of it that really stuck with me, because it's been several years, is that in her family, children were allowed to become a doctor or a lawyer. That was it.
Very similar.
Yes.
Asian, Indian,
Yes.
very similar.
You know, and those were the
Yeah.
only two options.
Absolutely.
Male or female.
Well, doctor and engineer
Yeah, it could be
were the
engineers.
for Iranians is the first, and
Okay.
then lawyers like the the default if you're really bad at science. You know,
So I
so
was just intrigued with that. So she, of course, really rebelled against her parents by becoming a writer.
okay,
And she
yeah.
was also working, I think, with Harvard because of these young Asians coming in who wanted to be writers, and their parents were just so
Yeah, that's very common.
aghast. That's the
Right,
only word I can
right.
think of right now, that their children.
They didn't come for to America for their kids to struggle, for their kids to
Right.
not. I mean, that's part of it.
You know, they wanted them to make money and
Yeah.
to live very well and very comfortably.
Absolutely.
So
Survival mode, and I understand that. I mean, I saw my dad bust his butt to put 3 kids into private school and pay for college for all 3 of us at the same time. It's not a joke to see that man work his rear end off. So there's a huge sense of guilt that goes with it. So it wasn't just, you know, that's part of why you go along with something like that is guilt and feeling like you know, yeah.
Well, we have a
But-
Chinese daughter,
Oh,
and
you're going to let her do whatever she wants to do.
well,
Because otherwise it's going to backfire.
within
Like it
reason,
did here.
there was
Yeah.
not a question
Right.
that she
Yeah.
was going to go to college because we each are the first in our families to go to college and graduate. So beyond BS.
Sorry, I'm laughing at your husband, not at you.
You know, there wasn't that pressure or anything. I'm putting some pressure on her to go on beyond just
Sure.
the BS in economics. So.
I think Isabel, you had a question?
Matthew, I'm curious in your work because from far away your sculptures look really soft, almost flesh. I had no idea what the material. Were I to guess the materials, they'd be totally different. I'm wondering whether it's at all purposeful that you sand them and sculpt them so that they look really soft instead of like wood, which is what they actually are. Because it takes that kind of beyond the first glance to notice that they're not made out of soft materials.
Yeah, I can't impress enough how beholden I am to drawing. And so, I mean, when I was in grad school, we had Jessica Stockholder as she was the director, and she's a very material-oriented person. And she would have visits with me, and she'd say, "I don't understand, like, why the message of this work is so nonsensical and the material is, so sensical." Because for her, her work is about nonsense and the material is nonsense, you know? And I would always say, like, I'm not a materials person. Like, it's just not in my being. Like, I think the only real message in the material is that wood is like grown and that it's warm and that it's like a material that humans have used from the beginning to sculpt, you know. And so it's, like I said before, it's a practical. I hate that that's true, but it's practical. And so I think like the drawing, the way that I draw, is the line is organic. And so like even though the drawing is in 2 dimensions, it doesn't usually have shading. I still imagined the forms to be soft. And I think also, unfortunately, it's kind of like a skill thing. So it's like when you get good at your skill, you start to show off, kind of. You know, I mean, it's not on purpose.
Yeah.
It's just that it's like you have so much hours. I mean, hours and hours and hours. For me, 6 days a week, like almost 10 hours a day. So I'm so intimate with this material, I can almost make it do whatever I want. And I think that the stages of creativity are such that it's like you struggle to find your content. And then once you find your content, you start to put it into practice. And then once you start to put it into practice, the logical outcome is what they call mannerism, which is when you become so good at something that you just kind of push it like Baroque. Mm-hmm. And so for me, like really a lot of the softness is just a skill level. And so sometimes lately, like I don't know if any of these, like actually in some of these, the yellow one that looks like there's smoke coming out of it.
Oh, I love
the
that.
smoke is actually me purposefully not sanding and trying to like put a little hurdle in the process where I'm like, no, I can like leave this, like, you know, I can like leave this raw and like
Wow.
go faster and not make it look like I'd worked so hard. Like we were having a working lunch together and we were talking about craft and she was saying how messy she is in the studio, and she said she was imagining that my studio was like this place where it's like everything is done with this like order. It's not true. It's just it's just harder for me to like go all crazy sometimes because I just imagine things to be smooth and to go together. And I think like for me, if I really had to trace it back like in a Freudian way, like in my house, the way that I grew up, my parents were always on me. Maybe all parents are on all their children, but like, why didn't you take your stuff upstairs when we said, you know, we put this shit here on the stairs and you're supposed to take it up when you go up, you know? And I never did that. I didn't care. I was thinking about other stuff. And so my parents were always on me, like, why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do that? And so I think even though I didn't want to become that person, I became a person whose value was like attached to like finishing and doing it and being disciplined. And like I became all these things that I, you know, because it was ingrained in my being. And so I think it's not a romantic thing necessarily. I think part of it is like showing off and part of it is like ingrained in my being.
Maybe time for one last question. Yeah.
Could you tell me about your studio practices and like you talked a little bit about routine and how important that is to creating work?
Do you want to start?
I mean, I try to work like I'm going to work, you know. It's difficult for me, quite frankly, as a mother. My brain just works completely differently at night than it does during the day. I'm not a morning person, but I kind of have to force myself to just show up at the studio to make the work. And I've still made some of my best work in those conditions, but I do feel like it's so much easier and ideas flow and things flow so differently at night. So someday when the kids are older, my daughter's going to be in sleepaway camp for the next 2 weeks, and my husband's really taking over, so I'm going to kind of replicate that for. But in a way, it's good for me because maybe I would just fill the hours and get lost and get in my own way for other reasons. In a way, having this circumscribed work day is that's all I have, so I have to give it my all. And,
For me, like I said, I'm a very routine-oriented person. I'm not like anal retentive about it, but I really get strength from going to the studio and working. And so I don't draw really at the studio. I mean, I do sometimes draw at the studio, but most of the time I draw a lot of times while watching TV. I found Buffy the Vampire Slayer to be really, really good, because I really, it's very camp, but it's like sometimes I'm just like, ugh, whatever, and then I'm just like drawing, you know? But I draw like at nighttime as well. I'm not a morning person either, but like I draw at nighttime, and I draw in little sketchbooks, and I try to draw as often as possible so that for me, one thing that I think is important for at least me is that I don't wait for inspiration. I practice. And so it's like it becomes like this thing where it's like I'm just always drawing, and it doesn't need to be good. It doesn't matter. You're just drawing. And so it's like, because I'm not asked to make a good sculpture and then I worry about making a drawing that could be a good sculpture. I just draw all the time, and then when I need to, then I look at what I did and I decide which is worthy to my vibe at that moment to like become something. But the physical part of my studio practice is a little bit different, because there's a practicality to running machinery, and I need to be like thinking, and like, you know, I don't want to like mess myself up. And so and then there's also a physical limit actually to like how much like, you know, like you can only do that for like a certain amount of time. And so for me, that's part of what fuels my internet addiction, is like I need something to do. I can't be reading necessarily a novel like every 30 minutes for 15 minutes or something. And so I use the internet and research things and stuff like that. But I go to the studio at about 11 and I work till like 7:30. And so in between there, like I take time off to look at the internet or call people on the phone or read books or look at books, actually, not read. And it's very dusty and dirty and that kind of thing. And so I like there's a whole aspect of it that when I try to romanticize it, is mystical in the sense that I have like a uniform and I have like a face gear and headphones, and the machines have a tone and the wood has a smell, and it's like there's all these things that happen probably for any artist that kind of transport you into this area where you're like, as she says, working. And so the work is really important for me, and I know for a lot of people it's not a part of their practice, and I think that's beautiful. But for me, it is very important. Working is also, like Negar said, is something that it takes me away from all the terrible shit that's happening. And so I go to the studio and I do my thing, and like she said as well, I hope it makes other people happy, and it's fulfilling to me and trying to make me a better person as well. And so I think I think for artists, a lot of artists, it really is, as we were talking about in lunch, a calling. And that calling is not really that dissimilar from people who choose to go to seminary school or something else. You study your discipline and you're very faithful. Almost, I think there's a difference between religion and spirituality, but I think for a lot of artists of our generation, at least, like there's a spiritual quotient to it, because otherwise it's not a great way to make money or be famous or loved and appreciated, you know? You're kind of out there by yourself doing your thing, and if you're lucky, like we are, some curator or somebody notices and gives you a chance to strut your stuff.
Great. All right. Thank you.